So, to talk about this number of lies, and the first one being the myth of the noble savage, we first have to understand what this myth is. Basically, the myth is the belief that when certain societies that were less advanced, for some reason, I'm going to talk a bit on why they were so less advanced. They lived in a communion with nature and they were less destructive and so on. The truth actually is quite the opposite. With the exception of the current time, which is basically starting with about in the 1900s when they forced democracy, the most failed concept of all time. It failed for Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and so on. They forced some type of usury practices like the compound interest and fractional reserve, which basically created the consumerism society, which is basically the main cause of the destruction of the planet. And they forced feminism, basically giving women leadership rights, when it again contribute to the destruction of everything. Actually, the noble savages were much worse for the environment than modern people. And the reason is quite simple. First of all, the noble savages that we are referring to were actually remnants of much larger civilizations that failed. Basically, let's talk about, for instance, for Native Americans. They were less than 2% of the original civilization, which failed due to a number of reasons. First, the practices that are so seen as so great actually meant that they were like locals. They cut some forests, planted something, and when the land was depleted, cut some more forests, planted again, and so on. And this happened in Africa, in America, and some parts of Europe. We see what happens in this situation in places where it's much smaller, like the Easter Island, which they cut all the trees in 50 years or something like that and destroy the whole ecosystem, and then move with boats to other places. And other places. Now, like Lebanon, again, same thing. And the main reason is that they are so destructive. They don't understand a few things. The first thing is the rotation of the crops. Basically, to not deplete the soil, you have to rotate crops. You cannot put the same crop year after year. You have to rotate them and have some years where the Jews were doing it once 7 years or something, where you don't plant anything so that the land rests, and so on. And now in modernism, because of the consumerist nature, they replace this with adding chemicals which destroy, well, they do the same thing, but humans that eat that food, they are extremely sick. Stuff like cancer and other diseases spread so much in these years. And the other thing was something that people still don't understand. They talk about emissions and all kind of crap, when the reality is very simple. You have to have a certain amount of trees planted to maintain the ecosystem. That's all. The trees absorb the emissions and everything. There's no problem. As long as you maintain a number of trees, be it an orchard or a forest, that's all there is to it. You have to maintain a number of trees and you have a stable ecosystem. Now, the reason why the Native Americans and other societies died were a few practices. The first and foremost being the spring orgies that were enacted in today's age by Saint Valentine's, and other similar pagan customs, which resulted in a lot of inbred people. And also another source of inbreeding was this isolation, and the fact that during human sacrifices, basically human sacrifices meant that basically the diversity was even lower, because the ones that were considered were lower rank or defeated in battle were just killed, and that included children. There are a lot of children sacrifices, something that the neo-pagans do not talk about, killing toddlers, and it's reunited today by the pill and by abortion and other stuff and so on. And as a result, they had a very destructive thing. Now, another myth is the increase in temperature. Yes, in some places there were higher temperatures, but that doesn't mean it's caused by humans. As I said, if you cut down enough trees, the weather will become kind of chaotic. Some days in some places will be very hot, in some places will be very rainy, in some places very cold. And the proof for that is that they predicted that in 2000 and in 2012 you'll have massive floods on coastal regions as a result of the melting of the ice cap, which never happened, and they still delay this. And basically is not the same problem. Another myth, very popular, is that the humans are the only species that hunt for pleasure. Now that's again something extremely false and stupid. In fact, there are a lot of species that hunt for pleasure, one of the most familiar with for everyone being the common house cat. There's the meerkat, there's the honey badger, and a lot of other animals that hunt for pleasure. Now, to hunt for pleasure, you need a certain amount of things. First of all, you have to be at the top of your food chain. You have to be a carnivorous or omnivorous animal. Basically, you have to be a hunter, a predator. And you have to have a lot of time and surplus energy. For instance, some of the tigers and lions do not have a lot of time because they consume a lot of energy when they hunt, and then they rest for long times to recover and so on. But if you have these things, basically a lot of energy, top predator and so on, then you'll hunt for pleasure. Although it's not necessarily a pleasure in itself, but more to maintain the ability to hunt, and that's where the so-called pleasure comes from, because being a predator, you have to hunt. Another myth the eco freaks want to spread and dislike spread is that the humans population is out of control, we are breeding way too much. That's complete bullshit, and I'm going to explain to you why. First of all, in the food chain, the lower you are on the food chain, the more you breed. For instance, and with the exception with some primates and a few animals at the top of the food chain, very few animals at the top of the food chain, basically they produce multiple offspring every year. That means that if they live for 30 years, let's say, they'll produce at least 60 offspring. At least. A human being unless it's some very rare case, like I don't know, the record was 40 something or 60 something, but where you produce a lot of triplets, sextets, and so on, produce very few children, and you need for almost every woman to produce at least 3 children in her lifetime for the population not to drop drastically. Basically, where we are now, except for Muslims, which do not believe in human rights, actually, 90 to 95% of the population might die very soon because of old age in many countries, like Germany, England, France. They don't have a native population anymore, only old people that will die. And 3 people for a human means at least 6 years of taking care of it, even if you don't are a responsible parent. You are, because if you are a responsible parent, then it means that for each children you have to be there for 7 years, so that means about 10 years. And the ability of a woman to reproduce, it's quite limited as in time. It's generally between 15 or 16 depending on the case, and about 30-35. So you have at most 20 years in which you can produce, in best case scenario, like 20 children. You can produce 20 children basically if you produce them one after another, and you always produce twins. Otherwise, you at most 5 or 6 children for most cases, because raising children, it's quite human children, it's a lot of work. And now we basically let them grow by themselves, and the state indoctrinates them and destroys their mentality. But the point is, considering how long it takes for humans to reproduce and how few children they produce on during the lifetime, the growth is extremely small, especially compared to other animals. Consider stuff like the Colorado beetle, the stink beetle, the hairy caterpillar, and the Atlantic tortoise, which basically destroyed whole ecosystem just by being moved from one place to another. So the point is, yeah, some species disappear, but that's the whole thing. It's generally not a problem. Also, another myth is that we can say, okay, why are we raising cattle and we don't raise, like, say, lions or something like that? Well, that's one of the main reasons. They reproduce very hard. They do not react well to captivity, unlike lower animals that are lower in the food chain. And they don't taste, okay, some of them taste good, but for instance, cat and dog, unless they are raised in very weird conditions, they taste very bad. So insects also taste very bad, low amount of nutrients, and of course they're very yucky. So yeah, that's another myth that insects will replace the food and they'll be great and so on. No, they consume much more than other animals. They're a bigger hazard and they taste like crap. It's just a way of indoctrination. Okay. Another lie, it's the whole electric energy thing. We're moving to electric energy and stuff like that, and we don't want to use coal. That's bullshit. Okay, first of all, with few exceptions, electric energy cannot be produced in large quantities, and countries like France and England and so on, which try this and they keep trying this, are seeing the result. Basically, most of the day they are without electricity, they're in cold and so on. So yeah, great for you, good. So basically, for instance, solar energy, unless you are in the desert, the amount of energy produced is basically as money, the same amount of the money you pay for the whole thing, for the installation. So no gain for you. But you're producing and then there's the belief that electric energy from solar energy and so on, it's because I want to see this because there's whole thing with electric cars, it's green. No, the batteries, they're not green. The electricity still has to be produced somehow. They're also not green. Once the battery has consumed, they have to be dropped. Again, extremely bad for the environment. So no, they're actually much worse than common fuel. Of course, there are ways to improve on stuff like emissions from cars. For instance, ordering some stuff in, not everything, but some stuff. In some cases, working from home where possible. For instance, the IT, it's one of the cases where in 90% of times you can work from home, no problem, and only the managers were preventing this. So there are some places where stuff like that can work. Also using doing carpooling, using the same car, multiple people working, using common transportations and so on, can help with this. But using electric cars is just a form of control. They want to control us, so that's not the solution. Okay, so we handle most of the... Now, the last one would be with waste disposal. Basically, the whole myth that, oh, you have to separate all the trash you produce into plastic and so on because it'll be recycled. First of all, most of it is not recycled. It's thrown in the same dump, and that's where it lands. And it doesn't help. It's like you try to resolve the effects without addressing the cause, when the cause is the consumers, or something like planned degradation of stuff. Basically, unlike years ago when a refrigerator, for instance, or TV would last you for 10-20 years, now it lasts 2 years and a bit, and then it breaks and you have to buy a new one. Similar to computers and so on. And this is basically the main cause of the waste that is produced, not the plastic wrapper you throw away. That's bullshit. So the main cause is this. And the reason why you have this deprecation is not necessarily the fact that the technology evolves. Currently we are basically to the tip of how much the technology can go. We have reached the tip. Basically only minor adjustments can be done, But the problem is the banking system, which basically it's the problem for most consumers today, which basically through the fractionary reserve and compound interest creates two problems. First, monopolies. Basically you have huge companies that own certain sectors of the economy, like sunglasses, like cola, like anything else. And when you have monopoly, you have you don't have innovation, you have a lot of poor people and so on. And also being a and the second so if you have fractionary reserve and compound interest, that creates this. And the second thing they create is the need for all companies to constantly grow their revenue. And here's the thing, you have a limited amount of resources, a limited amount of buyers that normally would not want to buy a new TV every year, okay, or a new, I don't know, refrigerator or whatever every year, because they don't have to, they don't have anything to do. So to increase their revenue, because they are forced to by the banks, they have to make the devices break after a certain time. So you are forced to buy another one. So if you want to stop the whole problems with oh, and I forgot one other thing. Things like European Union and United States of America, their policy on imports and exports of food, there are also some of the worst problems to the ecology, because normally you would have a small plot of land, you would do the whole rotation of crops and so on, but now you cannot do that because you cannot match the prices unless you basically put a huge piece of land with the same thing, basically after a few years turning it into the desert, things that we've seen in our country as well, and you are stuck. You are basically doing the same things that the natives were doing in the beginning of the video. So if you want to stop the ecological, dismember the European Union, forbid banks from doing the fractional reserve, basically say, okay, you have to have 100% on deposits unless it's a loan to the bank, which is a term deposit, and stop banks from being able to call for compound interest. And the last one, which will be possible only after this, is to replant as much trees as possible, either as orchards or as forests. And that's about it. I mean, there's nothing much you can do. Even if you kill all the people, the deserts will not turn green just by themselves. Someone has to plant those trees. It will not plant themselves. So you have to do this if you want to actually do something about this. Okay, goodbye.